Yeah, so it started off actually right around the same time where I had the entity manipulation and that happened that was featured on a haunting. I worked at a hotel in Salem, and I'm not going to name the hotel. So I had a situation where I was working the overnight shift and I heard what sounded like something banging metal. This is after weeks and weeks of weird things happening, like a black mass kind of like going into the lobby and then going into the elevator and heading downstairs. Hearing what sounded like a moaning that was coming from in the basement area that was still under construction. And then also hearing things that just were not that were not normal, like not normal noises. And this was off season in Salem, so it wasn't in October. It was a literal ghost town while I was working the overnight shift. So one night I heard the moaning coming from downstairs. I was making coffee for guests. And it was around 3 a.m, by the way. So I don't know why 3 a.m. is always the time that you have these experiences, but it was 3 a.m.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey. Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing. Nothing.
Excellent. I am with Sam Baltrusis, who really is a man who wears many hats. He's an author, a paranormal historian. He's a radio show host. He does ghost tours in Salem, which actually requires a license and requires a really specific set of skill set and expertise to be credentialed for that. He's done so many things. Sam, welcome and introduce yourselves to our audience.
Hey, Bob. So my name is Sam Baltrusis. I am an author and historian, journalist. I've been working in the paranormal as far as writing books for about 12 years, and I was a journalist before that, like for about 20 years before that. So I love writing books. I love doing my radio show and other things involved with paranormal investigation.
I like to throw in plugs early because a lot of times people want to know and look you up or maybe even find out about your books. Let's talk about first some of the books that you've written. The most recent one is Haunted Hotels of New England, which I've been reading, which is excellent. There's a personal arc in that, which we'll discuss later, and also your radio show, which is awesome. So if you don't mind, talk about where people can get your books and talk about some of your more recent ones and your radio show.
I've written 14 books altogether. My most recent book is Haunted Hotels of New England. The original idea with that was to republish a book that I wrote a few years back called 13 Most Haunted Hotels and Inns of New England. What I wanted to do is update some of the list. There were some hotels that were no longer open, or there are things that have changed over the years. Like the names have changed, for example, with the Providence Biltmore. So I wanted to update that. But I also wrote a book during the lockdown based on my experiences in Salem. And so I wrote a book called Cursed in Salem that has kind of spanned over a 10-year period as a tour guide in Salem, as someone who had multiple experiences in Salem. And so I kind of took those two books and kind of smushed them together and kind of created a narrative that really works well in my book, Haunted Hotels of New England. On May 1st, I actually launched during the lockdown a show called Paranormal Rewind. It airs every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on KCOR. It is a collaboration with my good friend Keith Bailey. And what we do is we interview paracelebs or people in the paranormal who have been on television or have worked on well-known cases, and we rewind those cases. So we actually go back and get the story behind the story when it comes to those famous cases, whether they're books or if they've been featured on TV shows.
Yeah, it's a great premise, and you guys do a great job. You mind telling us some of the guests you've had so far?
We start off with Brandon Alvis, who is on Ghost Hunters. We've had Jeff Bellinger. We've had Patty Negri. She was on Ghost Adventures. We've had Tim Weisberg and Mustafa Gadalari. What's really good about this show is that we want to spotlight different types of people, but we also want to learn as well. We want this to be both entertaining and informational at the same time.
Now, is it every Tuesday that it's on?
Yeah, that's every Tuesday night. It's on 7 p.m. Eastern time on KCOR. You can go to our website, paranormalrewind.com, to listen to all the archives.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's a really great show, Sam. You do a great job, both of you guys. Let's talk about your books really quick. Just tell people where they can get your books. I know you're on Amazon. If they look up Sam Baltrusis, Baltrusis, they can find you, but you have your own website. Let's just tell them that up front and talk about maybe some of your personal favorites of your books that you've worked on, and then we'll go into the haunted hotels of New England.
Sure, yeah. So I started out, my first book was Ghosts of Boston. To be able to access all of my books or to purchase all my books, you can go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Most of the bookstores in New England carry my books. However, as we know, we're kind of in a lockdown scenario. So the going to the bookstore experience, which I highly recommend, has been kind of limited during the lockdown. A good example is Wicked Good Books in Salem. They exclusively carry my best-selling book, which is called Ghost of Salem. And that's what I'm known for. It was a book that I wrote 2013, and it has been my international bestseller and kind of what catapulted me on the scene. But they generally carry that book exclusively, but I also sign copies. I'm able to go there and sign copies. So if you want a signed copy of that, you can go to Wicked Good Books. As far as my books, I started off as someone who was a journalist for many years. Coming in, I wrote a story for a local magazine called Stuff Magazine that's no longer, back in 2012. I got a lot of response, and I've always been someone who has written that paranormal themed article for the local newspaper or for a local magazine. And, I got a really strong response for this one article I wrote in 2012 called Haunted Hotspots in Boston. That turned into my first book, Ghost of Boston. And I have been writing at least one book ever since. And you can also notice from the beginning with me, I start coming out of the closet, if you will, when it comes to my clairvoyant abilities as someone who is not only sensitive to the paranormal, but also sees and communicates with spirits.
That's what adds a lot of value to your books, quite frankly. It makes them so enjoyable and adds, I think, a level of credibility. You mind telling us when you came out of the closet and how it got strengthened and kind of how you've evolved?
I was someone who had experiences with the paranormal as a young child. I always kind of equate myself with Danny Torrance from The Shining. I was terrified. I was communicating with a spirit that turns out was my grandfather. I thought I was talking to Santa Claus. I really did. And I was communicating with this man, and I'm like, I was describing it to my mother, the man to my mother, and she's like, "That's your grandfather, Sam." And I'm like, oh my gosh. When I realized what was going on, I put on what I call paranormal blinders. I still have paranormal experiences, like a hand grabbing my ankle when I was walking to work in New York City, outside of Washington Square Park. And I would just shrug it off as something that was explainable. So when I started writing my books in 2012, that's when I'm like, you know what? I'm going to approach this. I'm not going to be afraid anymore. And I was terrified. I was terrified of ghosts. I was terrified of experiencing things that were inexplainable, because I had experiences when I was younger that were scary. So fast forward, as I'm writing my books, I approach it. And I'll be honest with you. When I first wrote my first book, I was worried that as a journalist, I was going to lose my credibility. I remember my editor saying to me, it's like, "Do you really believe what you're writing?" And I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely, I do." The article that turned into my first book as someone who was a believer. When I wrote my first book, I was very cautious. So I would use words like allegedly haunted, or I would use journalism terms that kind of kept me objective and not as part of the story. Even though I did, obviously I was a believer. But what was happening is I would write my introductions to those books as like a first person experiencer going through Salem or through Boston. And those were the sections that people really, really enjoyed reading, and they wanted more of that. As I progressed as an author, I also started tapping into my abilities as a clairvoyant, and to the point where I was actually investigating these haunted locations in addition to interviewing other people who had paranormal experiences. Ghost of Salem was when I kind of broke out of the box and started coming being open about the fact that I was clairvoyant as well.
So when did you personally start opening up and saying, yeah, I'm going to be receptive to this rather than put the blinders on? Was there a life event that triggered that? Or is it just something that you eventually did? And did you have any training? Did you have any mentors that you relied to help you go through this transitioning period?
Yeah. So when I first wrote Ghost of Boston, I was in a haunted house in Somerville. I lived in a house in an old Victorian house. And while I was writing the book, I had multiple experiences with what I called the seamstress. And she was kind of like with me throughout the whole writing process. We kind of had a relationship. And when I started giving lectures for Ghost of Boston, my first book, I would kind of tell people about this woman I called Scissor Sister because she had an affinity for scissors. And people were really interested in this woman. I was worried about my credibility, so I didn't want to kind of go public with it. And then as I progressed and went more and more into these haunted locations, that muscle that I was working became stronger and stronger to the point where I think the turning point for me really was when I had a situation in Salem where I had an attachment that almost killed me. And then I had a shaman remove that attachment. And it kind of opened up my third eye to the point where my clairvoyant abilities have been through the roof since that event.
So, Sam, was that the story that was reenacted on A Haunting, the 100th episode of A Haunting?
Yeah, so that was pretty much the case that kind of changed my life. I worked on the U.S. of Salem in 2016 during the Halloween season. I was the manager of the paranormal experience on that vessel. And we had hundreds of people coming in and out. We had paranormal investigations, and we had a haunted house on a haunted vessel. That month and a half experience really beat me down. And then at the very end of it, I ended up doing an event in Topsfield, Massachusetts, which was considered Salem back in 1692, where I ended up trans-channeling Richard Crowninshield. And Richard Crowninshield was a story that I told over and over again on my tours in Salem. He was the murderer for hire that murdered Captain Joseph White in 1830. And I was telling the story, and I didn't know I had the ability to trans-channel. And I basically picked up an attachment that took over my body. I wouldn't call it a possession, but it was definitely an entity manipulation where this negative entity was using me as a vessel. And I had no idea what was going on. And I actually didn't even know that when I was communicating with Richard Crowninshield that I actually took him home with me. And so my life was turned upside down from that. But what that did, though, there was a spiritual intervention in a sense. My friend Joni Mahan knew something was wrong with me. She reached out to her friend, Michael Robichaud, who is a shaman who came in and basically removed the entity from me. And he was like, don't ever do that again. The portrayal of what I did on the TV show A Haunting, I did not give permission for the spirit to take over my body, which was how it was portrayed on the show. But I was connecting with the spirit, and I was getting information from it or from the entity. And that's kind of how it happened. So it was kind of I would call it like a botched seance that went awry.
Yeah, it's got to be kind of nerve-wracking too, not only going through that, but then having it be your story being told on the Travel Channel. I thought they did, just watching from my perspective, it was a very entertaining and well-done segment, besides what you mentioned, that you actually didn't offer yourself up, but it was really well done. And I think you've mentioned as well to me, offline, that actually it's probably one of the most popular ones too. So it's kind of scary enough to go through that, but then when it goes on TV, at least it's good that they got it right for the most part.
Yeah, and these shows, and as you know, Bob, like they don't necessarily always aim for accuracy, but I worked with the producers for about 6 months on making sure that this story was told and told accurately. And also it served as a cautionary tale to other people as well. The education aspect of it was extremely important to me because I didn't know what I was doing. And it almost killed me. So now that I know what was going on, I'm able to push it out when it happens. But I also realized that I have to be really careful because I have that ability.
Yeah, it's scary. I mean, I think you had a friend with you that night that actually kind of saw some of the stuff that happened and on the way home and started kind of raising some red flags. And then other friends noticed as well when you went kind of radio silent. So, and you had also mentioned, Sam, the USS Salem. One of the first people I interviewed, actually probably the second one, was Colleen Costello, a friend of yours, who's also mentioned in your book, Haunted Hotels of New England. And she won't go on the USS Salem anymore. She said she had a harrowing event that literally chased her off that ship. And she mentioned you a couple times that you were actually with her on that when that happened. Do you remember that?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of those situations. Like, I don't want to necessarily tell her story, but I will validate her story. I was with her. We were doing an event that night. We were both team leaders at this event on the USS Salem. This is actually about 6 months after I had my month and a half Halloween experience. So it was during the summer of 2017. And when I was with Colleen, she had crossed over a spirit earlier. And I was actually interviewing Colleen like on camera just to kind of get her take on like what happened that night. And as I was filming her, I saw this shadow figure emerge kind of behind her. I turned like a shade of white and Colleen's like, "What's wrong, Sam? What's wrong, Sam?" And I'm like, "Colleen, there's something behind you." You know, she wasn't alarmed at that time, but then she goes over to get something from her purse. She made a joke that apparently upset this entity. And I was right behind her as this entity was chasing her out of the USS Salem. And I'll tell you, she was like, after that, she wasn't the same again. We were very close before this event, and it really affected our friendship because I know what she was basically chased off the Salem, and that entity stayed with her for months.
Yeah, that's exactly what she said, episode 4. But yeah, she said exactly that. She literally ran off the ship. She got home. Her husband's like, "What are you doing home?" It took her a while to realize that she had an attachment, and it took a long time to get rid of it. She will never go back on that ship again. Because she had told me up front that she wasn't afraid of anything, but then she thought, you know what? That episode right there, that did kind of rattle me very much so.
What that showed me is, like, I mean, I was in a situation where I was able to watch this happen, and it kind of shows me that I'm put in this role, and I'm still figuring out what this role is going to be, but someone that has seen other people get attacked. How do I stop that? How do I help my friends not get attacked at these haunted locations? And, someone like with that situation with Colleen, that entity didn't affect, like, it didn't attack me at all. On the USS Salem, it attacked everyone around me, specifically women. And it's very hard to watch one of your close friends getting attacked, whether it's getting scratched or bit or chased off a vessel, when you're there with them.
Yeah, you have actually had some episodes I was reading where you've actually been scratched or had a burning sensation, and you've noticed, you lift up your shirt, you've seen whether it's the 3 scratch marks or the number 8 or whatever. Are you a psychic or a medium? Or I know there's a difference. What do you like to be known as?
I identify as a clairvoyant.
Okay, clairvoyant. All right.
The reason why I say clairvoyant, it's kind of like an umbrella term, and the parts of my abilities have evolved as I work the muscle. So when I first started, I identified as a psychometrist, and a psychometrist is where you can touch an object and get the historical backstory to the object. Then it kind of went into where I can go into a room and read the energy in a room. And after the entity manipulation that was featured on A Haunting, it's to the point where now I actually see spirit. Clairvoyant is to see, but I also hear them. I feel them. So it's it's an ever evolving gift that I've had since I was a child, but I've embraced those gifts and learned not to be afraid of them as I was as a kid. What changed for me was when I started writing about the spirits, I'm like, you know what? I can interview the ghosts like I interviewed celebrities or people that were featured in my articles as a journalist. And that started working for me. But what stopped working for me is when I was interviewing the spirits and I didn't like what they had to say or they tried to attack me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. There's. Do you mind just very quickly, at least one of those episodes where you had the 3 claw marks, or where you've had actually stigmata or whatever appear on you?
A lot of that happened when I was writing my book, Wicked Salem. Even back to Ghost of Salem, I had a situation where I went up to the Joshua Ward House, which is now a very posh boutique hotel called The Merchant. And I walked up to the Joshua Ward House when it was vacant, giving my tour, and I felt kind of like a burning on my chest. After coming home from giving the tour, I lifted up my shirt and there was a scratch mark on my chest. What I view, I'm very different. When I first had that experience, of course, I was scared. What I've learned is that a lot of times when you get scratched or touched or whatever by the spirit realm, they're wanting to get your attention. They're not necessarily attacking you. So my view as an author and as a clairvoyant is very different than it was when I first wrote Ghosts of Salem. I would say that, yeah, it's a little scary to lift up your shirt and see what looks like a mark of Trinity, which are 3 scratch marks, claw marks on your chest. But I view that as whatever was there was really wanting to get my attention. And I also had, during writing my book, Wicked Salem, where I had what appeared to be like a number 8 sort of like on my chest. So it was like a rash that appeared on my chest. So I interviewed Laurie Cabot that day, and I also went to Andover. I forget the location, but there was a location tied to the Salem witch trials where I went to, where I got the number 8 sort of like etched in my chest. Thinking about it, I'm like, perhaps it could be related to the 8 firebrands of hell that were associated with the Salem witch trials. Because I was investigating people like that were the final 8 victims of the Salem witch trials, like Samuel Wardwell, Mary Eastie, like Alice Parker, who are the final 8 people. So perhaps it was related to that.
So of all your books that you've written, was that the one where you felt the most endangered because of some of the locations you went to? Or was there a particular book you wrote where you were like, God, this is really putting me in some pretty dark places?
I will say this. I think I have been probably the most haunted locations in New England. Nothing can top what happened to me when I was taken over by an entity. I was basically possessed. I was levitating in my bed. I had to tie myself to my bed because I was worried about committing suicide in my sleep. There's nothing that can top that. So since then, I've kind of like, you know what? I'm not afraid anymore. And when I stopped being afraid, I'm looking at these darker entities as potential victims. I'm not afraid of them, and so I'm not giving the energy that I was giving them before. So I think that pretty much my whole career has been scary, but I choose not to be afraid.
That's good for you, because I think I would be afraid with that sort of stuff. You know, one thing I thought was interesting, and I definitely want to read the book, is Mass Murders, because you have a journalistic background. So you, as not only as a clairvoyant and a paranormal historian, you have also the journalistic side, and you were exploring some kind of, I think, unsolved murder mysteries in Massachusetts, and you cover several interesting cases in mass murders. Could you give us a little kind of glimpse into that book and some of your most interesting takeaways?
Yeah, so Mass Murders started off where my publisher, Glow Pequot, they really wanted me to do a book on the Lizzie Borden case. And you know, I have done even Lizzie Borden house is actually featured in my book, Haunted Hotels in New England. So I wanted to do something more than just Lizzie Borden. I wanted to do a book on looking at crimes in Massachusetts using a paranormal lens. There's one case or several cases that happen in Provincetown that have kind of like haunted me or interested me for years. One was the Lady of the Dunes in Provincetown. She was a woman that was found in 1974 during the summer with her head decapitated and her hands chopped off. And she was found mutilated on the beach of the Race Point Beach in Provincetown. Another case that happened in Cape Cod was Tony Costa, or Tony Chop Chop Costa, as he was known by the locals, where 4 victims were killed, and they were also mutilated in the 69, 1970. That case would have been the case of the century, but if there wasn't the Charles Manson murders that happened at the same time. So it started off with Provincetown and Lizzie Borden and kind of went on from there, where I was exploring a lot of murders that happen historically in Massachusetts with a paranormal lens.
Yeah, that's a fascinating premise. And was that first one, the Lady of the Dunes, was that kind of related to Whitey Bulger? Like maybe someone murdered because of that?
So if you look at the Lady of the Dunes case, that was where one of the authors that I feature in my book, Sandra Lee, she strongly believed that there were ties to Whitey Bulger. However, if you talk to Whitey Bulger's colleagues from that era, he did go to Provincetown often, but they strongly say that he was not responsible for murdering that woman. My goal really for the Lady of the Dunes is not necessarily to solve that crime. That would be great if we were able to, but it's to give that woman a name. She has been known as the Lady of the Dunes for 20 years, and I want to give her a name. And, we've gone psychically there to connect with her. She's come to me in my dreams. I go to Provincetown when I can afford it, to be honest with you, because it's expensive. But I go there to communicate with that woman because I want to help her. She's kind of stuck in the afterlife in Provincetown, and she's reaching out to me, people like me, to give her a name, really.
Wow, that's great. What's great about you is a lot of your books, it's not the same thing. You kind of go off and explore different avenues, and you did one called Ghost Writers, which was pretty cool. You want to tell us a little bit about that book?
Yeah, Ghost Writers actually is my favorite book. And what happened, it was released last September, but it kind of was overshadowed by Halloween. I don't know, but they're re-releasing it October 1st of this year. And I'll tell you, like that. So basically that book was, the premise behind it was to interview modern ghostwriters. So we have people like Joni Meehan, like Gare Allen, like Richard Estep, who I work with, and coupled with famous ghostwriters like Edith Wharton, like Edgar Allan Poe, like H.P. Lovecraft. So kind of looking at their ghost experiences back when they were authors, when they were alive. And in some cases we actually have people have spotted, say, like Edgar Allan Poe's ghost on Benefit Street in Providence, Rhode Island is a good example. So some of them are actually ghosts themselves. So it was basically a lot of writers that are still writing, coupled with famous writers that have passed. But I also had one ghostwriter that I included, which was Stephen King.
Yeah.
I actually reached out to him to be featured in the book, and he doesn't do that. But I did go to Bangor, Maine, to a lot of the spots in Bangor that inspired Stephen King. And that was so much fun to be able to go to the location where he would write the book, It. I went on a tour with a guy named Stu Tinker on the SK tours in Bangor, Maine. And he really had a lot of behind the scenes stories on Stephen King while I was writing the book Ghost Writers.
Oh, that's great. It seems like you write 2 or 3 books a year. I don't know, since I've only known you for a couple of years, but it seems like you have like 2 or 3 coming out now. How long did that one take you to write?
For me, it's about a 2-year process, Bob. So if you see 2 books coming out, like for example, I've already written a book before the lockdown that was called Ghosts of the American Revolution. That's not coming out until February of next year. So the process is about 6 months from when I turn it in to when it's actually published. So right now I am working on what I'm going to work on for 2021. I've taken kind of a break in a sense that I want to focus on quality and not quantity. So books can take up to a year, sometimes 2 years, depending on the amount of research. But the part that I love the most is the research part. I love going to all these locations. For ghostwriters, for example, I was able to go to Estes Park, Colorado, to the Stanley Hotel, which was a kind of like a dream location for me. Wow. Because that inspired the movie The Shining and Stephen King's book called The Shining. So I wanted to actually go there, and it was amazing. So I think the part that I love the most and the part that I miss the most is being able to go to these locations and to investigate these locations for my books. Because of the lockdown, I'm not able to do that as much because I have to rely on locations that I visited, like Salem, because of the lockdown.
Yeah, it could take 14 days to get back into the state in some cases. There's so many places to go with you, Sam, because there's so many things that you do. I think I first met you when my film, The Afraid of Nothing documentary, it premiered at the Boston Sci-Fi Film Festival You were, I think, director of operations for that. You ran 2 paranormal evenings. Mine was also with another gentleman named Bill Brock, who's very well known in the paranormal community in New England and probably even national now. It was a very blizzard night. I've had 2 films at the Boston Sci-Fi premiere. My first one, Blessed, which was a drama, and then this one, and both were during snowstorms. So I'm a bad guy to have on your docket when you're doing for Boston Sci-Fi, apparently. But want to tell us a little bit about your experience now and with Boston Sci-Fi and what else you're working on?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, I signed on 3 years ago to work with Garen Daly for the Boston Sci-Fi Film Festival. So I'm the director of operations. What I really wanted to do is to bring in my area of expertise, which is the paranormal, and to work with Garen on that with programming. So the first year I was able to do that was the year that you participated. So we had people like Bill Brock, who I'm actually working with now on a project at the Lizzie Borden House coming up later in August for the Dark Zone.tv. And then I also brought in Roxy Zwicker, who did an amazing short film. She was one of the featured guests as well. So it was a kind of an experiment, Bob, and I thought it was very well. It turned, in my opinion, it was very great programming. So thank you for participating with that. For this last year, we didn't really have a paranormal block, but we'll see what happens in the future. With that, I know that a lot of the film festivals are going online, and I'm currently working with the Fluff Festival in Somerville to move them to an online event experience. And I'm looking into the possibility with Roxy Zwicker to possibly do an online film festival for the paranormal.
People that haven't been to Somerville, that theater is just so, it's haunted too, isn't it? The theater that we were at, was it has some?
Yeah. It's actually it's in 2 of my books. I'll be honest with you, that is one of the major motivations for me to work for the Boston Sci-Fi Film Festival, because I wanted to be there overnight and I wanted to be there, more than just this one time. I wanted to spend a lot of time there. And as the director of operations, I'm able to be at the theater for 7 to 8 days around the clock. So I see it, what the theater looks like at 3 a.m. So yeah, it's haunted. The ghost is a flapper ghost that haunts the main theater. And, I wrote about her first in my book, Ghost of Cambridge. And then I expanded on the story. I forget which book I focused on, but Mass Murders, because I did a whole book on hometown hauntings or hauntings that were in my hometown.
You had also mentioned something, Dark Zone TV. Not only do you have a Lizzie Borden event coming up, you participated in a Conjuring House one, I don't know, maybe a month ago. I think that's a great new format. It's kind of like streaming at a haunted house for a week. You want to give us some background of what you experienced participating in the Conjuring House event and then talk about the upcoming one?
Yes. So I was asked, because I'm really good friends with Andrea Perrin, who was like the main speaker at this online event. What happened is I think that they were planning on doing a Paracon, like filming a show there at one point. And then when the lockdown happened, they're like, hey, let's actually do this online. And so they came up with this idea. Andrea recommended me. Also, the producer, I'm friends with him, Jay Bloomkey. He reached out to me as well to participate with it. My experiences with the Conjuring House, I'm terrified of that location. And I was basically coming from the perspective of seeing the Heinz family, seeing like a black mist like kind of swirling around them at an event that I attended at the Ocean State Paracon. Oh, wow. So from that perspective, also going into the historical backstory of the Conjuring House, because I actually interviewed Andrea Perrin for my book, Mass Murders. So we talked a lot about the historical backstory of that property in Rhode Island and why it would be haunted and what is actually there. To me, it's something that's ancient, and it's tied to the Native American massacre that happened during King Philip's War. I really strongly believe that. If you dig into the historical backstory, it does substantiate what Andrea and her family uncovered when you read her books, or whether you see her on the movie The Conjuring, or the story on The Conjuring.
Yeah, I did 2 episodes there. I went during the day. I didn't go at night. Basically, the clairvoyant we had there with us, Luis Escalera, as soon as he got out of the car, he was like, it's the land. It's the land before he even got in the house. He felt it was all tied to the land, and he continued to emphasize that. So, yeah. And so let's talk about the Lizzie Borden one coming up. What's that? I'll certainly have this up before then, but give us a date and where they can go and what they might expect from it.
Yeah, so after the success of The Conjuring House, a lot of the people formed an online community where they wanted more, or they wanted more investigations during the lockdown. A lot of people really, myself included, when I was actually watching the 24/7 live stream from The Conjuring House, and I felt like I was able to actually investigate the house without actually being there, which was awesome for me. But I'll tell you, people were getting affected. But what happened is, like, people like John Huntington, who was the investigator, kind of became, I would say, like kind of like an online celebrity from that live stream.
Oh yeah.
And we all called him Papa John. It was pretty cool. It was cool just to see a live streaming event have the same power as, say, a television show, and what was cool about it was interactive, and you were able to talk to John while he was investigating. So it was a really great format. So when Lizzie Borden, when the producers came up with location number 2, I did recommend the Lizzie Borden house as the second location, and they reached out to me and they're like, "Yeah, we're actually gonna do Lizzie Borden." And I'm like, "Well, make sure that you do Maplecroft as well, because in my book Mass Murders, I actually go into the later in life home of Elizabeth Borden in Maplecroft. So there's a lot of ghostly backstory to Maplecroft as well." And then I also said, I have something to tell you. I'm kind of like wanting to go public with this, but I'm related to Lizzie Borden. And I have told people that at events and kind of on a hush hush, but I haven't gone public with it, mainly because I was really focused on the fact that I was related to the Putnam family, who were the major accusers during the Salem witch trials. And I wanted to be sure that I was related to her. So my mother, who is our family genealogist, she has spent months and months doing research and backing up the claim that we're related. And we're not only related to her through Richard Borden, but we're also related to her through Innocence Cornell as well. So we're related to Lizzie at 2 different family lines. So it's really fascinating. But the event is going to be on the darkzone.tv, August 28th through the 31st. I'm going to be on Saturday night, and it looks like I'm actually going to be there. So I will be there. My job, and I'm not going to give too much away, but my job really is to communicate with my family members and to approach them as family and also as a clairvoyant.
Yeah, that's a great angle. I know that you, with a friend of mine, Danny and Lauren Perez, you went there. There's some interesting stuff that came out of that. I don't know if you want to talk about that or if you're going to save that for that Dark Zone TV show, but you've been finding some things that people don't really associate or didn't know with Lizzie Borden. It was kind of another chapter that people may not be aware of.
Yeah, so that happened on March 13th, Friday the 13th, and it was right before the lockdown. So, all
right, wow, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so thank goodness we were able to go, because I think that if it was 2 days later, we wouldn't have been able to do that. So we were there, and this is when the lockdown was just happening. So when I say, we were just finding out that cases were happening in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and that area. So we go in, and I was filling in for a friend's who was unable to make it because she was filming a movie. So I came in last minute to be sort of like the lead investigator. And then Lauren and Danny came in as well. So we as a group, that was Lauren's first time at the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast. So I've been there multiple times. So I wanted to, I'm like, well, do you have a spirit box? And Lauren's says, oh yeah, I have a spirit box. And I'm like, do you have a blindfold? Do you have earphones? Like, let's try the Estes method here, because I've never done it here before. And I'll tell you, it started off as like an experiment, and it was probably the most profound paranormal experience that I've had in that house to date.
But I remember you because there's something about sexual abuse and things like that.
Yeah, there was. When I was doing the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast, I was on every floor with a blindfold on, with noise cancellation earphones, and the Spirit Box 7 connected to that. And then people from the audience were asking questions. So people at the investigation were asking questions, and then I was channeling.
Yeah, and then I think you had to go to work because you work at night at hotels, and then Danny went and was blindfolded. He had some interesting things. So
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, doing the Estes method with someone who's not trained, it's dangerous. And I told Lauren that from the beginning. And I think that they had a pretty profound experience, a kind of like a life-changing experience. But I also think it's very dangerous to Bob as well.
yeah. All right, so let's pivot and talk about, so your mom found out in Ancestry.com connections that really, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, the past 10 years or so, most people would think it's a blessing. You're writing all these cool books. You get to be in the heart of the paranormal. You're on TV. You're a radio show host. You're doing film festivals. You're all over the place. But in some aspect, it was somewhat of a curse. And you felt kind of connected to what was going on with Salem, but you didn't know what it was. And then your mom came up with some connections, which kind of blew your mind a little bit, and then also made some things made sense, correct?
Yeah, so this is after the episode that was featured on A Haunting. This was after my book, Wicked Salem. So Wicked Salem came out about a year and a half ago. And so I was at the book signing at the Hawthorne Hotel. I get a call from my mother, and she's like, Sam. I'm like, yes, Mom. She's like, I think we burned witches. I'm like, they were hanged. They weren't burned, but give me some names. And so she gives me the list of names, and I knew that we were related to the Gould family, but the Gould family had a woman, Priscilla Gould Putnam. So we were actually tied to the Putnam family from Portsmouth, Rhode Island, because I knew our family was from Rhode Island. And so everything kind of rocked my world after that. It explained like my obsession with the Salem witch trials. It explained my connection to the victims, and almost my guilt associated with the victims. I always felt like when I was telling their story that I would get emotional, like when I would go on my tours and give my tours, and I didn't understand like why was I so connected? And the reason why I was so connected is because my relative, Ann Putnam Jr., accused 62 people of witchcraft, and a large portion of them were executed. That's why I felt guilty.
Hey, everybody. This is your paranormal podcast pal, Bob Heskey. Every night I like to listen to videos on YouTube. But lately, with COVID, civil unrest, market volatility, politics, conspiracy theories, I just want to tune out. That's why I like Audible. What's Audible, you say? Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment and audio books, including some great horror and paranormal titles like A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay, If It Bleeds by Stephen King, and The Boatman's Daughter by Andy Davidson.
This place is cursed.
Each month, members get 1 credit to pick any title, plus 2 Audible originals from a monthly selection, access to daily news digests if you actually want to hear the news, as well as guided meditation programs. Hey, we all need a little Zen now and again. And Audible is oh so easy. You can download titles and listen offline, anytime, anywhere, on any device. The app is free and can be installed in your smartphone or tablet. You can even listen across devices without losing your spot. How cool is that? If you can't decide what to listen to, no problem. You can keep your credits for up to a year and binge on your favorite series later on. So, here's the rub. The Afraid of Nothing podcast is stoked to partner with the audio bookworms at Audible to offer you a free 30-day trial membership. Just follow the link in the show notes, audibletrial.com/AON podcast.
Puedes repetir eso, por favor.
That's audibletrial.com/AON, all caps, podcast, lowercase. Full disclosure, I get a commission for everyone who signs up using that URL. But you get to try it for 30 days without a commitment. Using our custom URL doesn't cost you a penny and helps out the show if you do sign up. Nothing scary about that. So escape reality and pick up a book, an audiobook, and listen to what's out there. Go to audibletrial.com/AON podcast after listening to the show. Okay, every once in a while doing these podcasts, I have some technical difficulties. Someone has a bad internet connection. That's usually the biggest problem. But with Sam on this interview, he started talking about, after he mentioned that he found out he was related to the witch trials and doing an apology and all that good stuff, he was also talking about an entity called the Man with the Hat, which we'll hear a lot in the second part of our program. And kind of at that point, it went just gray, where he was talking, but it wasn't being recorded on the system that I had. So I had actually a fear that I lost the first part of the interview, which I was able to salvage, and fortunately I was able to get Sam back for the rest of the interview. So one other note, the first night after our interview and the next night, I kept waking up with having a hard time breathing, almost like someone was sitting on my chest. I am a heavier guy, full disclosure. I do have sleep apnea, which I've had for a while, but I usually don't have that. So I tried to do a little bit of self-cleansing, and lo and behold, I was okay on the third night. Sam, you'll hear mentioning in this interview later on, he doesn't like talking about the Man with the Hat bringing things into his apartment because he feels it could bring things upon him. So who knows what happened, but that was a little bit weird. Okay, on with the rest of our show. Okay, so we're back. We had a little bit of technical difficulties, which is one of the rare times we've had, but it's, Sam, you had mentioned whenever you talk about the subject with anybody, some weird stuff happens with the computer, and it's almost what happened with me during the documentary when the shaman, Brad Little Frog Hudson, was trying to cleanse a board of 7 demons. All of a sudden, no sound was going into the boom mic. It was going in, but it wasn't coming out to the recorder. And so kind of lost you, even though you were talking. So if you don't mind, let's pick up where we left off.
Yeah, so basically my good friend Dina Mason, she is a high priestess, a Wiccan high priestess. And she and I met on one of my tours in Salem years ago. When I was on the tour with Dana, I basically said, I had a sensation that someone on the tour was related to one of the witch trials victims, and my dowsing rods pointed to Dana. It turned out she is related to one of the witch trials victims, and I'm related to one of the accusers. So we have an accuser, and we have a victim descendant. It was the Reverend Samuel Paris Foundation, which is this kind of like the remnants of what was Ground Zero during the Salem witch trials in modern day Danvers. So we go there, we do what we call an apology ritual, where we read the apology of Ann Putnam Jr., who was one of the, in my opinion, the baddest afflicted girls out of the bunch. We know a lot about Abigail Williams from The Crucible. We know a little bit about Betty Paris from The Crucible, because those were the 2 first afflicted girls. But Ann Putnam Jr. accused 62 people, and a large percentage of the people that she accused were executed. So she worked in tandem with her neighbor, Abigail Williams, and also worked in tandem with the other afflicted girls to accuse and execute these innocent men and women. But Ann Putnam Jr. actually wrote an apology years after the Salem witch trials, saying that she was deluded by Satan and that she was sorry for all the egregious things that she did in 1692. Kind of like a faux apology, I would say. But if you read it, it's very passionately written, in a sense that she was trying to get back into the community because there was a severe backlash against her after the Salem witch trials. She was not let back into the church, and she ended up dying very young. So kind of a sad, miserable life, and rightfully so. I mean, she was a major accuser, and I think she was a puppet for her dad, Thomas Putnam, who also died young too.
Wow. Did you get closure out of that, or is there more things that need to be done?
Well, I'll tell you, when we did the apology ritual the first time, I felt like we had closure, and I felt so good. I felt like a cloud lifted. I apologized to Dana. She accepted the apology. Elizabeth Howe is her ancestor, and so she accepted the apology on behalf of Elizabeth Howe. And we felt so good. But then we did a show called Forbidden History, where we went back there to recreate the apology ritual. And then we also talked about the spirits of Salem. And while we were doing this, things kind of went a little awry, in the sense that I started channeling an entity right outside the location on Essex Street, which is close to where you were filming, Bob, at the Magic Parlor, where there was the demons associated with the spirit boards. And this entity, Dana steps in. She puts up what she calls a shield of protection, or crystal shield. And the entity bit her while we were on camera. Yeah, it was pretty bad. So I thought that there was closure, but there was still more to happen. And at this point, the entity not only scratched me, but it also bit my colleague Dana.
Well, now it owes you an apology, right? Wow, I'm kidding. I'm half joking, but it's just, geez. What did you kind of make of that? What did you guys say when that was done and you went and had a drink or whatever? What was your takeaway from that?
I mean, my take on it was that what we were dealing with was not human. I basically encountered a man with a hat years before at that location, actually right next to the Magic Parlor. Bob, there may be some ties to what Brad uncovered as well.
Yep.
But it had a hat. I thought it was related to the Salem witch trials. But what I got from this other experience where Dana got bit and I got scratched, that there was something inhuman that was at play and it wasn't related to the witch trials. Or maybe it was, but it wasn't a human in a previous life.
The man with the hat. So that has been an ongoing thing. Probably in Salem, was that probably the thing which kind of tormented you the most that you had to deal with? Was the man with the hat, what that connection was and why you kept running into this entity?
Yeah, so it started off right around the same time where I had the entity manipulation and that happened, that was featured on a haunting. I worked at a hotel in Salem, and I'm not going to name the hotel, but it's actually very close to Wicked Good Books and also the Magic Parlor on Essex Street. And so I had a situation where I was working the overnight shift and I heard what sounded like something banging metal. This is after weeks and weeks of weird things happening, like a black mass kind of like going into the lobby and then going into the elevator and heading downstairs. Hearing what sounded like a moaning that was coming from in the basement area that was still under construction. And then also hearing things that just were not that were not normal, like not normal noises. And this was off season in Salem, so it wasn't in October. It was a literal ghost town while I was working the overnight shift. So one night I heard the moaning coming from downstairs. I was making coffee for guests, and it was around 3 a.m, by the way. So I don't know why 3 a.m. is always the time that you have these experiences, but it was 3 a.m. And then I heard what sounded like someone banging a metal. I ran upstairs to Essex Street to see if someone was breaking into the Magic Parlor or to Wicked Good Books. And then I look into the window and I see what looks like a man with a hat on. And we had this weird connection, like telepathic connection, because I was kind of frozen I was frozen in fear. And I was telepathically getting from this entity. He was like, "You can see me." And I was like, "Yes, I can see you." And that was the beginning of a relationship. This entity stalking me for about 3 years.
That was going to be one of my first questions was this entity surprised that you could see him? And the answer is yes. And did you pick up that it was an entity, not human, more demonic, or did you get any sense regarding that?
I'll tell you, when I first saw it, it did have red glowing eyes. Yeah. That was scary. I also thought there was an exit sign right behind it. And I thought maybe the exit sign was kind of like, it would look like glowing eyes. I just didn't want to think that it was a hat man with glowing eyes. I wanted it to be a human in a previous life. But the more and more I explored this entity and the more and more I was stalked by it, the more and more I realized that it was feeding off my energy, which is the climax of my book, Haunted Hotels of New England, because I first met or experienced the man with a hat working the overnight shift at a hotel. But that experience continued while I was giving tours in Salem and also while I have filmed shows in Salem. So this was an ongoing stalking experience with this man with a hat. And I wanted to believe that it was one of the witch trials victims or related to the Salem witch trials. But I think that this is something else. And I think maybe it's a thought form, which is something that's created by ghost tours telling the story over and over again. And somehow has become this sort of non-human monster.
Where does the man with the hat appear? Does it show up at your apartment? Does it show up at work? Or does it show up just at events? Or you just never know when it's going to show up?
You never know what's going to show up, but it seems to be tied geographically to Salem. So whenever I'm in Salem, I have, I've worked there for years. So I gave tours. I worked at the hotel. I've worked at the House of Seven Gables. So I would have experiences periodically, especially when I was giving tours. The tour office was right around the corner that I was giving tours with. It was called the Salem Historical Tours. there was one time where, we were having a lot of paranormal activity in the office, like books being slung off the wall. There was one situation where this paperweight was kind of slung at me in the office, like it was trying to get my attention, basically. So yeah, it's geographically tied to Salem. And even the time I was giving my book launch lecture at the Hawthorne Hotel in the library, we saw what looked like a man walk behind the video screen, like up to me. And someone had, was filming it. So it was kind of strange what was going on. I think we were able to debunk it at the time as like a vent. But what's strange about it, there was, you could see what looks like a man's feet walking underneath the screen. So there was something going on there. So it's just been an ongoing relationship. And I'm to the point now, I did the Estes method at the Hawthorne Hotel, which is the finale of my book, Haunted Hotels of New England, with Lauren and Danny Perez. And I do think that I got some closure in the sense that I realized this entity was an energy vampire, and it was draining my energy. And I can't give that entity my energy any longer.
I hope you do shut that off, because this certainly does not seem productive. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting being you, Sam. You never know when you wake up what you're going to deal with. Because what is how often does it, do you run into, when you're sleeping, do you deal as a clairvoyant? Do you see spirits? Or are you just able to shut it off when you go to bed and have your downtime when you're writing? Or what is it like being you dealing with these entities that are around?
Bob, I'll be bluntly honest with you. It's been challenging. So my home is a safe zone. I don't allow any spirits or entities into my home. When I do my Facebook Live posts, I'm like, from my not haunted apartment in Somerville, Massachusetts.
It's like your tagline.
Because, so I set boundaries, so they're not allowed. So I actually had, my shaman friend, Michael Robichaud, has done where it's like, it's basically all the bad stuff is warded off. But I will tell you, by talking about it at home, because I've never talked, like before I would talk about the Hatman entity in Salem and not at home. I'm worried that I'm kind of like, I guess, giving it energy in my home,
Yeah, sorry.
So
right.
I'm a little wary about talking about the stuff in my home, because I do think when you talk about it, you do give it energy. And I was definitely giving it energy. And so I don't have a problem in my home, Bob. I have problems at certain locations. And usually it's locations that are, like Salem has a lot of bloodshed. There's a lot of, this aura of disaster in Salem that to me is overwhelming. Some people feel energized in Salem. I've always felt the complete opposite in Salem.
Yeah, one of the people in the film, Kyle Carvin, feels like he's drawn to Salem from the witch trials. He felt that he was there, and he's had mediums tell him that. So you're right. Some people are drawn, and other people realize it does have a heavy energy there. So, Sam, not only you're an author, I think we mentioned you're also on television. You're on The Haunting. Your story was the 100th episode, one of the most widely watched of that show, and it's 10 years plus, I guess. You've also been a commentator on other shows. You want to tell us a quick list of some of the shows you've been on and some of the ones that may be coming? We may not know when, because we know in this lockdown with COVID that things change for scheduling, but just been the past couple of years, you've been pretty busy.
Yeah, so right before the lockdown, I filmed 3 shows, and one of the shows was Forbidden History, which has already aired, and that is where I go back with my friend Dana Mason. We go to Salem, and we kind of do the apology ritual for the TV show. And that appeared on the Science Channel, and I thought they did a fantastic job with that. I also filmed 2 other shows that were in Toronto. One is Paranormal Night Shift, and Paranormal Night Shift, I actually go into detail about the man with a hat experience that I had working the overnight shift at the hotel. The time has kind of has changed over. It was supposed to originally premiere on the Travel Channel in March, but because of the lockdown, it was pushed to August, and it actually may even be pushed even further to October, because what happened was the production was halted during the lockdown in Canada. So the episode that's called Paranormal Night Shift is called Family Secrets. And it's episode 2 of Paranormal Night Shift. I also worked on a show called Hotel Paranormal as a fill-in expert. And I basically filled in for multiple people who have had experiences at hotels. But what's happened with that as well is they're holding me off to season 2, I believe, because I filmed right at the very beginning of the lockdown. And the goal was for me to be put into what was already edited for American audiences because it first premiered in Canada, but because of the lockdown, there was like limited resources for doing that. So hopefully I'll appear in season 2. It may end up where I'm cut from Hotel Paranormal, but it was an amazing experience nonetheless because it was Dan Aykroyd's the narrator of that show. So it was fantastic working on Hotel Paranormal. Whether or not I make it to the Travel Channel, it remains to be seen.
Well, I hope you do. I mean, you are a guy who your day job is your night job. I mean, you write during a lot of times at these hotels where you'll be the night manager or the night clerk or whatever your function is. And that's where you get a lot of your writing done, I believe. So I think you'd add a great perspective to it. So let's talk about, you have been so many places. I don't want to ask what your favorite kid is, but, in terms of haunted locations, let's just keep it in New England. 1 or 2 top places that you think are the most haunted that we may or may not have heard of? And then where would you like to go that you haven't been yet?
Well, just to promo the upcoming Dark Zone TV, the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast in Fall River, when I first came in, I had mixed feelings about the Lizzie Borden. I thought that it was overhyped. Having spent multiple overnights at the Lizzie Borden house, I definitely think it's one of the most haunted locations in New England. Another location that just kind of opened up recently that's, to me, is more haunted than the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast is Maplecroft, which is also in Fall River, and that's Lizzie Borden's later-in-life home that she shared with her sister Emma after she was acquitted from the murders in 1892. Other locations, the USS Salem, to me, is the most haunted single location in New England, without hesitation. I had so many experiences there to kind of, I was able to go back actually during the lockdown because we had an investigation plan. So I would recommend the USS Salem. And, I'm in a documentary that hopefully will come out soon called The Spirit of the Sea Witch that goes into the hauntings associated with the USS Salem. And locations that I want to go to that I haven't done, I want to expand beyond New England. And we're seeing that with a lot of the events that are coming up in 2021 that I'm participating in. One is, a lot of it's in the western part of the country, like Vulture City, which is where I'm going to be part of a Paracon coming up in 2021. It was scheduled to be in 2020. And then also, we recently announced I'm working on a collaboration with my fellow ghostwriter, Richard Estep, who to me is one of the top paranormal themed authors in the business. And we're working on a book at a location yet to be announced, but there is a nautical theme associated with that location. So looking forward to that. So a lot of the stuff that I work on, I have to kind of keep top secret until we can announce it publicly.
Another thing I didn't mention about you, by the way, is Mass Paracon. I know that's on hold for this year, but I had the pleasure of going to it last year. What a great event that you put on, and you've done it for several years, and there's another one in 2021. You want to give us a quick plug on, fingers crossed, where we can attend that?
The plan was, because it was the 400-year anniversary of the Pilgrim's Landing in Plymouth, the plan was to have it 2020 in Plymouth. So we announced it before the lockdown, and then the lockdown happened. And we were still hoping that we could have the Paracon in Plymouth in 2020. But because of all the state regulations, we had to move it to 2021 at a different location. So it's going to be in Quincy, Massachusetts at the Adams Inn, which is where a hotel that I've worked at. What's interesting about that location, not to give too much away, Bob, but that is where Whitey Bulger would bury his victims.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's haunted too, and it's a haunted crime scene. A lot of people don't know that. The hotel obviously does not want to be associated with the fact that there was a burial right outside of the hotel. But as someone that writes about the paranormal, it's definitely of interest because I think that there's spirits wanting for me to tell their story. So September 17th through the 19th, 2021, go to massparacon.com to get your tickets. We just transferred over all the 2020 tickets to 2021. So there's very minimal tickets available for the upcoming event, but we're looking forward to making this an amazing, bigger, better event in 2021. And I feel really good about the date because it gives us enough time to have a vaccine,
Yeah.
And to be able to open up again. Because right now we're able to function, but it's definitely functioning at a reduced level to adhere to the phase 3 regulations in the state of Massachusetts.
your Paracons sell out quick, and you have a good following and people that are repeat purchasers that like to go every year. So I can attest to what a great program you put on, and I recommend that people do if they can get a ticket, they do it. Sam, let's just end with let's revisit where they can find out more about you and get your books and your events that are coming up. So let's just tell us where we can get your books and Dark Zone TV and anything else that you have brewing.
Sure. So pretty much everything that goes on in my life, I update on sambaltrusis.com. And you can also go to Amazon.com, and then you can actually like me as an author on Amazon.com, so you'll get updates automatically when I release a new book. I recommend that because what happens when you go to my website, Amazon.com is pretty good about alerting people when my books come out. So I recommend when you go to Amazon.com, like me as an author on my author page, is that you'll get updates automatically from Amazon.com. Also, I do Facebook. As you know, Bob, I try to keep my Facebook list to just friends, but I do have a Facebook author page. And I would recommend there's a Sam Baltrusis Books is one of my Facebook pages where I update specifically on the books that come out in the TV shows. So type in Sam Baltrusis, author, or Sam Baltrusis Books, and you'll be able to find me on Facebook. And I'm also on Twitter as well.
Excellent. So you're everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay. Sam, thank you so much for your time. I know we had a little bit of it seems like almost a paranormal intrusion earlier on. Let's see if we can save the earlier part. But thank you so much. You do so much, and it was a pleasure meeting you a couple of years ago when my film premiered at Boston Sci-Fi, and I'm so happy you've kept me connected with me since then. So thanks for being on the show. You have so much to share. It's so great to hear your stories.
Thank you, Bob. And it was a pleasure meeting you as well. I feel like that people come into our lives for a reason. And I think that you came into my life for a reason when you did. And it's really interesting when watching your film, Afraid of Nothing, a lot of those locations I've been to and investigated in my past. The fact that Brad had almost identical experiences as I did at these same locations was very fascinating. So I think that we were supposed to meet each other, and I'm glad that we kept in touch.
Oh, thank you so much. I would glance at you every now and then when it was playing, and I could see you kind of watching, especially when Brad was on, and I could almost see you nodding a little bit. I was like, oh, good. Thank God. He's on board with it. So it's great. So thank you. I appreciate it, Sam, and we will be following all the things that you do.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit AfraidOfNothingPodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's AfraidOfNothingPodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout-out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.